There's one more thing that I need to mention before we can actually get into a demo, and that is how to generate archives and some of the things to keep in mind there. So what I did is I reset the project to the project that I'm going to be demoing from, and I have a series of files in here. These are simply titled 012345, and so if I open these up, you'll see that these are tiles that I want to use for some sort of roof coverage. So there's a second one. Let me show you the other ones as well. There's just a basic tile with a texture on it. All these tiles have some texture on it. They vary in size and shape to interlock in certain ways. And so if I open up this last one here, you can see this too has a texture on it. So a couple things to keep in mind if I open up the attribute editor here. You'll see that you can have as many components to your file and to what will be your archive. But what is important to keep in mind is that you can't create hierarchies here in the outliner. That seems to not really want to work with Xgen. So create very flat hierarchies here, in that the geometry, if you have 3 or 4 pieces, they just sit side by side in the outliner. There are no nulls that are a part of it. The other thing here that I discovered is something that had to be set up are baked textures. So you can see that in this case, this was built from a cube. That was simply baked from this menu up in here. So convert file texture Maya software, make it a relatively small texture. It's not really necessary for that to be big. Obviously, each component on the Xgen side is going to be repeated many, many times. Another something to keep in mind is the scale of your of what will be your archive. So in this case, I fit it within a couple of grid units. It's actually going to regenerate at that actual size because there's a size control on the Xgen side, which is by default set to 1, and you can change that to whatever you want. So kind of keep in mind what size of archive you're generating in terms of physical size and space, because that will affect the way it's going to fit on the model. And that's relevant because if I have, let's say, a tile that looks to be a few units on the grid, but then I have a model that is extremely large and it's this archive that I want to spread across that model, it's going to fit many times by default, which will really slow down the process of actually generating and first previewing the Xgen description. So you're better off either mapping this onto a model that's a little smaller so it doesn't repeat as many times, or making your archive larger so it does the same thing. Okay, so to generate this as an archive, under the Xgen menu set, make sure that this is selected. You only have to select the geometry, and you can do an export selection as archive. And what I did is I actually put this in a custom location. Make sure that you define where this goes. This too is actually important, that you keep this as part of your working directory. I think I remember me having some problems with generating archives in just a general location, so that I have like a library of archives that I can use for any Xgen project. That at some point I don't think worked very well. I'm going to store this under the Xgen, not the Xgen folder, the archives folder. And let's say we'll pick the folder here, archives, select that, there it is. The archive name will be test, so let's call this just something generic. If you like, you can turn on automatic LOD, which will generate archives at a percentage poly reduction automatically. Could be very useful if you're generating geometry that just needs just a generic poly reduction percentage and just for representation purposes. And if you wanted to include the animation, you can set the frame range from within here. So as soon as you hit export, I'll leave the LOD set, the LOD preset here disabled. As soon as I export this, it takes the geometry, it takes the textures. There it is, archives. And we now have an archive called test.xarc. That's the extension for archives. So that's the other extension here that I wanted to mention. So we have xuv.xgen.xdrac.xarc, and within the 3 folders, if you don't have an archive, if you have nothing in this archives folder up in here yet, It will generate the test text file, which is essentially a log, the test.xarc, as well as an ABC, a materials, and an MI folder. So in this case, the ABC folder will contain the test.abc. The materials folder will contain the MI materials, and the MI folder will contain the .mi file that you need to be able to render in MentalRay. And so this is all the stuff that's required for you to be able to render everything related to your archives in MentalRay. There's also under Xgen a batch convert, and so in here you can browse and select any number of files. So if you were to go in here and select these 5, you can put them in, again, a custom location, which would be the location that I was using before. You can see that the default path here is again to the default Maya project, which is not good, so we have to go ahead and reroute that. Here too you get the same controls in terms of LOD as well as animation, and then you can convert this. It will write out a single log file, but you will have 5 .xarc files and all the appropriate materials in terms of .abcs, .mi, and Maya materials. Okay, so that's a way to batch convert. Once you've done that, you've built yourself essentially a small library that you can start to tap into to map stuff onto geometry.